In the last set of published vault numbers, London still reported 27,729 tons of silver sitting inside the LBMA system at the end of January 2026. That sounds like abundance, it sounds like comfort. But here's the catastrophic part. The market has started behaving as if the metal that matters is disappearing, not months from now, not weeks from now, but in 48 hours at a time, whenever stress hits the plumbing. One side of the trade keeps pointing at the mountain. The other side keeps paying up to access the door, and the numbers don't let you hide. The same report values that London silver stockpile at roughly $92 billion and translates it into about 924,304 standard 30-kilogram bars. That is a city of metal. Yet the price tape can drop hard on a margin notice while the physical world tightens at the exact same moment. They said this could never happen in a mature market. They said inventory totals prevent shortages. But the system is showing you a different reality in real time. Institutions already know how these cracks form. They've traded through them before. They understand which inventory is technically there and which inventory is available, deliverable, and unencumbered. Most people only see the headline price. They don't see the financing rules. They don't see the classification games. They don't see what happens when collateral requirements change overnight and the weakest hands are forced to sell into a falling screen price, even while real-world buyers pull metal out of the pipeline. Here's where it gets interesting. The story is not that silver is rare in the universe. The story is that market access to silver becomes rare in the moments that matter most. And what I'm about to reveal changes how you interpret every vault headline and every sudden price. Break from here forward. Welcome to Vault Signals. This channel exists for one job: decoding the mechanics beneath the headline before everyone else is arguing about the headline itself. If you like analysis that treats markets as systems, not slogans, you'll feel at home here. And if you're listening like a wise elder taught you to listen, keep an eye on this channel and drop a comment with where you're watching from, because the geography of demand is part of the story. Now let's reconstruct what actually happened, because the timeline matters. The pivot point was December 29th, 2025, when volatility in silver ran hot enough that the exchange risk controls started tightening the screws. Margin requirements on key silver futures were raised into the move. One widely reported example put the March 2026 silver futures margin around $22,000 and then roughly $25,000, a jump of about $3,000 per contract. On paper, that looks like a technical adjustment. In practice, it's a force multiplier. Silver is a leverage market. A contract represents a large notional amount of metal, but only a fraction of that notional is posted as collateral. When that collateral requirement rises abruptly, the market doesn't politely reprice. The market liquidates. Traders who were fine yesterday discover they are under-margined today. Some meet the call, many don't. Positions are cut. Selling hits the screen price. And because this is happening during volatility, liquidity thins, spreads widen, and the move feeds on itself. Here's the abnormality. During those moments, the paper price can drop quickly, but the physical market does not always follow in the same direction or at the same speed. Real-world silver is not a blinking number. It is bars, coins, inventories, shipping windows, insurance, and credit. When financing conditions tighten, the paper price can become less meaningful as a signal of immediate availability. The central mystery is this: why does a market that can show 27 of Inhouse's 769 tons in London still behave like the deliverable layer is vanishing when stress hits? To understand that, you have to see the pattern. Silver has a long history of episodes where the headline price is not the real story. In 1980, silver ripped higher during the Hunt brothers era. The outcome wasn't just a price peak, it was a rule response. Exchanges changed margin requirements and trading rules, and the market structure did the rest. In 2011, silver surged again, touching the high 40s per ounce. A sequence of margin hikes and tightened conditions pushed leveraged positioning into forced liquidation, and the drop came faster than the average observer thought was possible. In March 2020, a different kind of dislocation hit. The world locked down, logistics froze, refineries and transport became constrained, and the gap between paper quotes and the real cost of acquiring physical metal widened in ways that looked impossible until you lived through it. Premiums expanded, delivery timing stretched. The screen price was one story, and the physical price you could actually pay was another. The playbook was the same across decades. Stress appears, financing and rules amplify it, and access becomes the real price. In late 2025 and early 2026, it's happening again, but in a more subtle and more institutional form. The evidence is not a single headline. It's the alignment of several signals that normally do not move together. Start with the vault numbers because they're the anchor everyone argues about. 3% month over month, 3% move sounds tiny, almost dismissible. But on a base that large, tiny percentages represent massive bar counts. When you translate that tonnage into the reported 924th or 304 standard bars, you're talking about flows that can remove thousands of bars without making the headline tonnage look dramatic. Now, layer in the second pool of metal that people cite as proof that nothing is wrong, the big exchange-traded trust. $0 billion. Again, that sounds like abundance. 500 million ounces sounds like a fortress. But an ETF is not a warehouse where you casually walk in and grab bars. It's a structure with authorized participants, creation and redemption mechanics, and a very specific purpose. It can reflect demand, but it can also absorb metal into a custody chain that doesn't necessarily solve a deliverability bottleneck elsewhere. The question is why a market can look liquid on paper and illiquid in reality. So who is positioning around this? Follow the institutions that control the gates. The first gate is the futures exchange and clearing system. When the margin requirement moved around December 29th, 2025, it wasn't a random decision. It was a calculated response to volatility and risk. Clearinghouses exist to prevent default cascades. Raising margin is their primary lever. But that lever has side effects. It forces deleveraging. It punishes the most leveraged participants. And it can flip the direction of price without changing the underlying need for metal. The second gate is the vault network itself. London vault totals are an aggregate. They do not tell you which bars are earmarked, which are leased, which are encumbered, and which are truly available to satisfy urgent demand. The market cares about the free float. In tight conditions, free float can shrink faster than totals. It can be pledged as collateral. It can be tied up in long-term agreements. The tonnage number can look stable, while the accessible layer becomes brittle. The third gate is the ETF ecosystem. 10 ounces, that number represents a custody chain. The question is not whether the custody exists. The question is how that inventory interacts with stress in the futures market. When paper markets are under pressure, some participants seek metal exposure through vehicles like ETFs. Others need physical bars to settle obligations or satisfy industrial needs. Those are not the same demands. The inventory can be there and still not relieve the specific pressure point that is causing dislocation. You can see coordination without needing to assume conspiracy. Timing is enough. When margins rise into volatility, paper prices can fall sharply. That fall can shake out speculative demand and reduce urgency in the headlines. Meanwhile, the physical market can quietly tighten because the participants who truly need metal do not stop needing metal just because the screen price dipped. In fact, dips can increase physical buying if the underlying concern is access rather than price. And notice how the system signals stress without announcing it in plain language. The first response is a tightening of terms. Higher collateral, wider spreads, tougher credit, and a preference for the largest counterparties. That is institutional triage. It tells you who gets served first when the line forms. A standard COMEX silver futures contract represents 5,000 ounces. Multiply that by the screen price and you get a notional exposure that can run into the hundreds of thousands of dollars per contract, while the margin posted is only a slice of that. That slice is the engine of volatility. When margin rises by about $3,000 per contract, it's not just a cost increase, it's a constraint on how much risk can be carried by the same pool of capital. If a fund is running 1,000 contracts, that single change can demand roughly $3 million of additional collateral immediately, or the position must shrink. Now add the bullion banks and market-making desks that intermediate between buyers and sellers. Their job is to provide liquidity, but their first obligation is to manage balance sheet risk. When volatility spikes, balance sheets shrink. Dealers quote less size and charge more for immediacy. They demand stronger collateral. That is not drama, it is risk management. But it has a direct effect. It makes it harder to source physical quickly, even if the total inventory number looks calm. Then there are the industrial users who treat silver like oxygen. For electronics and solar components, silver is an input, not a trade. When they see instability and tighter credit, they can quietly extend coverage, locking in supply for longer periods. That reduces spot availability, and it does so silently because it happens through contracts and schedules, not headlines. Finally, there's the form and location problem. A bar exists, but not in the right specification, or not in the right place, or not in the right custody chain. Converting and moving metal takes time and money. Under stress, that time and money becomes the premium. This is why two people can both be quoting silver and still be talking about different realities. A tonnage statistic is a photograph. Stress trades the close-up when the clock is ticking. Now let's define the dislocation in plain terms. The paper market is fast, leveraged, and rule-bound. The physical market is slow, logistical, and constrained by real-world frictions. When those two worlds diverge, you get the phenomenon that people feel as shortage, even if the total inventory number is large. Think of it like an airport during a storm. You can have thousands of seats in the system, You can have planes parked at gates, but if a small number of runways and crews are constrained, the effective availability collapses. The system isn't short of airplanes. It's short of usable capacity at the moment that matters. Silver behaves the same way when the deliverable layer is constrained by financing, location, form, and rule sets. This gap cannot persist forever. Historically, when paper and physical diverge, one of two things happens. Either the physical market loosens and premiums compress, or the paper market is forced to reprice, to reflect the true cost of sourcing deliverable metal. The direction depends on which side has the stronger constraint. In episodes where logistics and availability are genuinely tight, paper eventually has to respect it. In episodes where fear outruns reality, physical relaxes. The trick is reading which constraint is binding, because that determines what breaks. Here's the evidence chain that helps separate noise from signal. First, the LBMA number itself, 3% month over month, valued around $92 billion. That is your baseline. It tells you metal is present in the system, but it also tells you flows are occurring. In tight markets, the flow rate matters more than the total. When the monthly change is negative during a period of volatility, it suggests demand for allocation and movement is active, not dormant. Second, the ETF number, $0 billion in net assets. This tells you that large pools of metal are being warehoused in financial form. That can be a symptom of investor demand, but it can also be a sign that metal is being pulled into structures that reduce the free float. A bar that sits in a custody chain for a trust is not necessarily a bar that can immediately satisfy a delivery bottleneck in another venue. Third, the margin lever, the jump of roughly $3,000 per contract. Around $22,000 to $25,000 for a key silver futures contract is not a small adjustment for leveraged participants. It is an immediate liquidity test. When that test arrives, forced selling can break price down even as underlying stress remains. This creates the perfect environment for dislocation. The screen price becomes a liquidation price, not a clearing price. Fourth, the behavioral tell. In every modern episode of tightening, you see the same psychological split. Commentators point to total inventory as proof nothing is wrong. Meanwhile, buyers who actually need specific forms of metal at specific times report delays, premiums, and tightened terms. The contradiction is not emotional, it is structural. Total inventory does not equal accessible inventory. Now let's walk through the mechanism, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. A margin hike is like raising the height of a doorway while people are already running through it. Those who are tall enough pass. Those who aren't hit the frame. In markets, tall enough means liquid enough. When the required cash per contract increases, you have three options. Add capital, reduce positions, or exit. If you can't add capital quickly, you reduce positions. Reducing positions means selling. When many participants sell simultaneously into a thin market, price drops. That drop triggers more risk controls. More controls trigger more selling, and the move compounds. At the same time, the physical market is responding to a different stressor. Physical buyers care about continuity and certainty. If they sense instability, they may increase allocation, lengthen their coverage, or shift sourcing. That can pull metal into longer-term holdings, reducing the metal available for short-notice delivery. So while the futures market is forced to sell because of margin, the physical market can quietly buy because of access concerns. That is how you get a falling screen price alongside tightening real-world conditions. This is also where the paper versus physical story becomes more than a slogan. Paper contracts are promises governed by rules. Physical metal is an object governed by logistics. When the rules tighten, paper participants can be squeezed out without any change in global mine output. When logistics tighten, physical participants can face scarcity even if paper contracts trade freely. The dislocation lives in that mismatch. Now connect this to the historical pattern again, because history doesn't repeat perfectly, but it does rhyme in the same places. In 1980, silver's rise met a rule response and the market structure did the rest. Result, a violent reversal that surprised people who thought a commodity couldn't drop that fast. In 2011, silver's surge met repeated margin hikes in rapid succession. Result, the leveraged side was forced to liquidate, and price fell far faster than fundamentals changed. In 2020, a global shock created logistics and refining constraints, and the cost to obtain physical diverged from paper. Result, a visible premium and delivery strain that made people rethink what spot price even meant in practice. In 2026, the pattern is volatility, tightening collateral rules, and a visible emphasis on where the metal sits and how it can move. The system is reminding everyone that access is not guaranteed by totals. So what does this mean going forward? Not a prediction, but a framework grounded in how this pattern has behaved historically. If volatility continues and margin remains elevated, the paper market is likely to stay prone to sharp liquidation breaks. Those breaks can occur even if physical demand is stable or rising. because forced selling is not the same as voluntary selling. Historically, in that environment, premiums and allocation demand become more important signals than the screen price alone. 3%, the cumulative effect can matter. A series of small declines can translate into a meaningful reduction in the free float, especially if the metal being removed is the most deliverable, most accessible portion. In that scenario, the market can move from tight to stressed quickly because the marginal bar sets the price under pressure. If, on the other hand, vault totals stabilize and physical availability loosens, the dislocation can fade, premiums can compress, delivery timing can normalize, the paper market can reassert itself as the dominant price signal. That is the conservative scenario. Stress cools, and the system absorbs the shock. The moderate scenario is persistent divergence. Paper volatility remains high, physical stays firm, and the market lives in a two-price reality where the headline price is a reference point, not a settlement point for real metal. This is uncomfortable because it undermines trust in the single number narrative. The aggressive scenario is the one history warns about in episodes where deliverability becomes the bottleneck. A sudden repricing event where the paper market is forced to recognize the true cost of sourcing metal under constraint. That repricing does not need to be linear. Historically, when it happens fast, because the market is trying to clear a shortage of trust, not a shortage of atoms. So, what should you watch specifically if you want to understand which scenario is forming? Watch the plumbing indicators. Watch whether margin requirements ratchet higher again during volatility. Watch whether reported vault totals keep drifting lower, even slightly, over consecutive months. Watch whether large pools of inventory remain locked in financial structures, while the deliverable layer tightens elsewhere. And watch the behavior of premiums and delivery times in the physical world, because that is where the stress shows up first, when the screen price is being driven by leverage. Now we arrive at the divide, and it's not about being smart. It's about paying attention to what the market is actually saying. There are those who see a large inventory number and stop thinking. And there are those who ask the second question. Available to whom, under what rules, at what time, in what form, and at what cost? The wealth gap in markets is often an information gap. Institutions move first because they live inside the plumbing. They see collateral changes before they hit headlines. They understand the difference between an aggregate tonnage figure and the free float that can settle obligations under stress. Retail tends to move last because retail is trained to watch the price and ignore the structure. When you see London at 27,129 tons and you hear someone say, "Nothing to worry about," remember that totals can coexist with tightness. When you see a margin jump from roughly $22,000 to $25,000 per contract, and you watch price drop, remember that liquidation is not a referendum on availability. 10 ounces in a trust, remember that custody is not the same as deliverability at the pinch point. This is Vault Signals, where we decode what matters before its headlines. If this connected dots you hadn't lined up before, you know what to do. Because the question isn't whether the system shows stress from time to time. The question is whether you can recognize the pattern early enough to understand what the market is actually pricing when it looks calm.